The winter wind crawled across the abandoned plains long before the sun decided whether it wished to rise. It carried with it the kind of cold that did not simply touch skin but settled beneath it, making a home in bone and memory alike. On the far edge of a forgotten valley, a man walked alone with a tired gait and a heavier soul. Elias Mercer did not remember the exact moment life had stopped being life, only that one morning he woke up and the world had already gone silent. His boots pressed into frozen dirt that cracked like brittle glass with each step. The sky, washed in the faint blue of early dawn, stretched above him like a great empty cathedral. He kept walking. That was all he had left: footsteps, breath, and the ache behind his ribs that had lived there ever since the fever took his wife and newborn son 3 winters ago. He hadn't spoken their names aloud in months, maybe years. He wasn't sure anymore. Time slipped strangely when a man stopped expecting anything worth waiting for. He passed the old creek bed, dried and split like an old scar, past the tall sycamore, where birds used to nest before the storms, took the high branches. Elias had walked this land his entire life, and it still felt foreign now, like a home that had forgotten him. The ranch cabin sat behind him, tucked between dead cottonwoods. He rarely looked back at it. 4 walls meant little when the warmth inside them had gone. He reached the far fence line as he always did before sunrise. Habit was a quiet companion. The world held its breath around him, waiting. Elias rested his palm on a frost-coated post, eyes narrowing when he noticed a shape he did not recognize near the ridge, something still, dark, wrong. He stopped walking. He wasn't a man who startled easily. Grief had a way of dulling surprise, but even from a distance the figure looked out of place, an outline that didn't belong to rock or brush or shadow. He stepped closer. A few paces more, and the shape resolved into something unmistakably alive. A mule. Thin as neglect itself, ribs sharp as winter branches, tied to a dead stump with a rope so frayed it looked ready to surrender at any second. The mule shivered, not from cold, Elias sensed, but from the kind of fear that grows deep when the world stops being kind. Elias approached slowly. The mule's ears twitched, but it did not step back. Its eyes, dark and glassy, followed him with a patience that did not feel natural, as if it had been waiting, as if it knew the shape of loneliness standing in front of it. Then Elias saw it, a strip of cloth tied around the rope, soft, faded, once pink perhaps, now almost gray, but unmistakably a child's blanket. The type a mother sews late at night, humming promises into each thread. His breath caught despite himself, and pinned to that blanket, brittle and worn, a note. He pulled it free carefully, fingers trembling though the cold could not be blamed. Please save him. He belonged to someone who loved him once. That was all the paper said. The wind rose, tugging at the edges of the note, urging it away. Elias closed his fist around it. He looked at the mule again. The animal's stare was steady, quiet, almost pleading. "I can't save much these days," Elias muttered, voice rough from disuse. "Barely saving myself." But his hands were already untying the rope. The mule didn't run, didn't flinch. It simply lowered its head, letting Elias slip the frayed line into his grip. Something warm, strange, unwelcome, moved in Elias's chest, a feeling he hadn't felt in too long. Not hope, more like a memory of hope. He walked the mule back toward his cabin. The valleys around him slowly filled with morning light, though he barely noticed. His mind churned with questions he didn't want answers for. Who tied the animal here? Why the child's blanket? Why the note? And why, after 3 long winters of nothing but emptiness, did Elias feel the faintest stirring of something he thought had died with his family? When he reached the barn, the mule followed him without resistance. Almost gratefully, Elias brushed a hand over its neck. The coat was rough, the muscles weak beneath. Neglect, not injury. Someone had abandoned it. Someone desperate. Inside the barn, the shadows softened. Dust motes drifted like tiny ghosts through thin shafts of early sun. Elias gathered hay, filled a pail with water, checked the mule's legs, its hooves. No wounds, no signs of abuse, only absence. The kind that lingers long after someone stops caring. "You need a name," Elias said quietly. The mule blinked at him. "Not giving you one," he warned. Naming things makes them stay. The mule nudged his sleeve. Elias exhaled sharply. Don't get clever with me. The mule nudged him again. Fine, he muttered. Not a name, just calling you the mule. Temporary? The mule seemed unimpressed. Elias walked outside before he could talk himself into caring. He had fixing to do. Work that kept his mind from wandering places it shouldn't. But every so often his gaze drifted toward the barn. And each time, the mule was watching him through the cracked slats. Quiet. Still. Present. Elias didn't know what to make of that. Nor did he expect the woman who appeared near sunset. Her horse approached at a trot, hooves striking frozen ground with the kind of certainty only experience could give. She rode like someone who had crossed many miles of open land and expected more before nightfall. Her coat was thick, dust-stained and travel-worn. Her hat shaded a face that carried a familiar kind of tiredness, the kind carved not by years but by loss. She dismounted with a grace Elias hadn't seen in years. "Evenin'," she called, voice steady, educated, but softened by the plains. "I'm looking for a mule. Gray-brown, thin, rope-haltered. Went missing 2 nights ago." Elias froze. "Who are you?" he asked. "Margaret Hale," she replied. "Schoolteacher by trade. Woman by necessity." Then softer, "and caretaker of the mule until circumstances changed." Elias hesitated. Margaret's eyes flicked toward the barn. "Is he here?" There was no point lying. "Yes." Her chest rose with relief that looked close to breaking. "May I see him?" Elias nodded. She walked into the barn like someone stepping into a memory. When she reached the mule, her hand rose slowly, trembling as it brushed the animal's cheek. "There you are," she whispered. The mule leaned into her touch. Elias watched silently from the doorway. Margaret inspected the mule with practiced hands. "Thank God he found kindness." "Wasn't much kindness involved," Elias said. "Just a rope and a note." Margaret stiffened. "A note?" He handed it to her. She read it once, then again as tears welled in her eyes. "My sister wrote this," she whispered, "before she passed last week. The fever took her fast, faster than I could reach her." Elias stared at her. "She had no children," Margaret continued softly, "but she treated this mule like one. Loved him more fiercely than she ever loved herself." The blanket, the note, the abandonment. Suddenly it made sense. Margaret's voice cracked. "Before she died, she made me promise to find him a home where he'd be cared for. Not sold. Not worked to death. Loved." She touched the mule's neck. "I tried. Someone stole him from my wagon while I slept." Her eyes met Elias's. "You saved him." "I didn't do much." "You did everything." Elias looked away, unable to hold the weight of gratitude he didn't feel he deserved. Margaret took a shaky breath. "If it's all right, I'll stay the night. He's still weak. I want to make sure he's truly safe." Elias hesitated. He had kept people far from his home for years, but something in her voice, quiet, broken, familiar, felt like listening to himself. "One night," he said. "No more." "Thank you," she whispered, as the sun bled into the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the land. Elias felt something stir inside him again, small, unwelcome, persistent. Not hope, but maybe the beginning of it. Something neither he nor Margaret nor the mule had expected to find. On a cold, forgotten evening in the middle of nowhere, night settled over the valley like an old quilt, patched with shadows and blue moonlight. The wind quieted, brushing only lightly against the barn door as if it, too, understood something fragile was unfolding inside. Elias moved through the dim cabin with stiff motions, lighting a lantern for his unexpected guest. He hadn't shared a roof with anyone in years. The small space felt foreign now, too alive, too warm, too aware. Margaret followed him in after seeing the mule fed and settled. She paused just inside the doorway, her breath misting in the cold air, eyes scanning the simple one-room cabin. The fireplace glowed low, its flames licking faintly at the logs. A tin kettle rested near the coals, steam rising like an invitation. "It's humble," Elias muttered, suddenly self-conscious. "But it stays warm enough." Her voice was gentle. "It feels safe." Safe. He hadn't heard that word spoken about his home since his wife had lived. Elias busied himself at the stove, making coffee though his hands trembled slightly. Margaret removed her gloves, kneading warmth back into her fingers, eyes drifting toward the window that overlooked the barn. "You live alone?" she asked quietly. 3 years now. She knew better than to pry. Grief recognizes grief. It handles it like a glass too thin to grip tightly. Snow began to fall outside, fine flakes swirling softly like white ash. Margaret watched them, her face touched by the faintest sadness. "She would have liked this place," she murmured. "Your sister?" She nodded. She loved wide skies, places where the world feels larger than sorrow. Elias sat across from her. "What was her name?" She hesitated before answering. "Anna. A soft name. A small wound. The kind that once spoken bleeds again." Margaret traced the rim of her cup with her thumb. "Anna was the better of us. Gentler. Quicker to laugh." Her voice tightened. "I wasn't there when she took her last breath." Elias looked down at the wooden table, hands tightening. He knew that guilt intimately. The guilt of being too late, too far, too helpless. "The fever comes fast," he said. "Takes what it wants. Not much a person can do." She studied him quietly. The shadows on his face spoke of stories he hadn't shared yet. "I'm sorry," Margaret said softly, "for whoever you lost." Elias didn't respond. Words clogged in his throat, thick as mud. Speaking their names felt like inviting ghosts into the room. Margaret didn't push. She only nodded, accepting silence like a companion. After a while she stood. "I should check on him before sleeping." They stepped into the night. Snow fell thicker now, turning the ground pale. The barn glowed warm from inside, lantern light dancing against the frost. When they entered, the mule lifted his head, ears flicking toward Margaret as though recognizing his anchor in a world gone strange. She pressed her cheek to his neck. "You're safe now," she whispered. Elias watched them. Woman and animal, grief and loyalty intertwined. "He didn't want to lie down earlier," Elias said. "Seems afraid to." "Animals remember abandonment differently," Margaret murmured. "Not in words, just in wounds." Her hand smoothed the mule's muzzle, calm and steady. Elias swallowed. "You should sleep." She turned to him, exhaustion softening her features. "Wake me if he worsens, even the smallest change." "I will." She nodded once, trusting his word more than a stranger should. When Margaret finally lay on the cot near the fire, Elias stood in the doorway longer than he intended, watching her breathing slow. Snow tapped gently against the window. The mule's breathing in the barn steadied. The world outside grew quieter. He should have gone to sleep. Instead, he walked into the dark yard, boots crunching over new snow, and made his way to the tree line, the place where he often spoke to the memories he kept buried. He stopped beneath the skeletal branches of an old oak, breath creating fleeting ghosts in the air. "Am I a fool," he whispered to the night, "for letting people near again?" The wind answered with silence. Elias tipped his head back. "I can't carry more loss. Don't give me something I can't keep." The cold bit at his skin, sharp and honest. He closed his eyes. From behind him came the soft crunch of footsteps. Margaret, wrapped in a blanket, hair undone from her braid, lantern held low. "Are you all right?" she asked, voice hushed. He turned. The lantern's light caught the strain in his face, and she paused, understanding more than he said. "I thought you were sleeping." "I tried," she whispered, "but grief wakes easy." Elias exhaled shakily. "Some nights I can't breathe in that cabin." "Then don't go inside," she said softly. "Not tonight." They stood in the quiet snow, two silhouettes carved from the same ache. Margaret stepped closer, lantern flickering between them. Her breath shook. "You don't have to explain your ghosts. I have enough of my own to recognize their weight." He met her eyes, dark, steady, unafraid of the cracks in him. For the first time in years, Elias felt seen. They returned to the cabin side by side, neither speaking. Something unspoken connected them. Thin, fragile, but real. Something neither expected, neither sought, but neither stepped away from. Inside, the fire warmed the room. She lay back down, exhaustion winning. Elias lingered at the door, watching her until her breathing deepened into sleep. He whispered into the dim glow of the cabin, "Don't stay long." But even as he said it, something inside him already hoped she would. The spring thaw came slow. not as a single roaring thing but as a patient unbuttoning. Each day the sun lingered a little longer. Each night the air lost an inch of its bite. Snow that had sat like a held breath at the edges of fences began to sag and loosen, sliding from roofs in wet, sighing sheets. The creek that had been a memory all winter remembered itself again, murmuring under ice and running with a timid confidence. The ranch responded to the change as if waking from a long sleep. Elias found himself repairing boards he had left to rot, replacing shingles he had told himself could wait another year. He mended not out of diligence, but because work gave the right kind of tiredness. One that left room for easier dreams. Margaret took to the mornings like a rhythm born to her. She rose before the light to check the mule, to warm the food she carried for him, to tighten the straps and speak in low measured tones as though coaxing trust out of bones and memory. When the town noticed them together, it did so with the slow curiosity of people whose days were ordered by routine and rumor. Gossip is a small thing that grows with time, and the county had more time than sense. Mrs. Harmon's eyebrows still pointed, permanently upward. The pastor's polite nod carried a tightness that a man wears when he holds questions he cannot name. But there were others who watched, and in their watching, softened. One afternoon a carriage rattled into Elias's yard, the sheriff leaning out of the driver's seat with the all-business expression of men, accustomed to measuring trouble by the hour. He left the driver and came to the porch with steps that made the floorboards complain. "You Mercer?" he asked. "I am," Elias said. "Pastor spoke of you at the meeting," the sheriff said. "Town's short on hands for spring. Folks asking about help plowing, fixing fences. Wondered if you and your hired help could lend a hand." There it was, the language of usefulness. Elias found himself answering before thought could weigh in. "We'll do what we can." The sheriff tipped his hat and departed. Margaret watched him go, and a small, almost amused smile ghosted across her face. "Useful," she repeated. "That's a North Star for a widow and a man with a cold past." Elias looked at her. "Won't change what people say, though." "People say," she shrugged, "until they see the work done and the mouths fed." So they worked. Word spread. A widow and a solitary man, hands steady and quick. They fixed a broken fence for old Henderson, rolled a hay cart across soggy ground for Mrs. Keene, plied rope for the miller when a pulley snapped. Margaret's hands were deft with tools and animals alike. Her voice had the quiet command of someone used to, coaxing more from the reluctant than anger could ever bargain for. Children followed her like small currents. She read aloud by the riverbank to any curious ear. Pages tattered, voice soft as flower. Elias watched often, a slow warmth rising at the sight of small faces lifted to listen. He heard a small girl ask once, mid-sentence, "Are you a teacher?" And Margaret had simply nodded, then turned the page like the act itself was enough to explain the rest. That evening, as they walked the lane back to the cabin, Margaret spoke of Anna in ways she hadn't before. Little stories like bright threads pulled out of a dark sweater. Anna liked to press her hands into warm bread dough and hum hymns they barely knew the words to. She'd taught small girls to sew stitches so even and neat the needle seemed to honor them. When she laughed, her laugh gathered around her like company. Margaret's voice trembled sometimes and then steadied. She did not seem to be rehearsing grief, but living alongside it now. Elias shared, in turn, fragments he had kept like coins in his pocket. The way Sarah used to tie a kerchief to the handle of the well bucket, the way she'd hum off key when mending a sock, the soft scent of lavender that lingered in the corner of the bedroom where she loved to sit. He did not speak of the fevers last night, not at first, but one star-heavy night when the mule had restless dreams and the barn smelled of wet hay and old fears. Elias told the room out loud what he carried. "I left her," he said simply, voice low. "I went for the doctor too late. Roads were bad. I thought I could fix a way in the morning, that she'd hold on until then. I was wrong." Margaret listened without flinching. There was no consolation speech in her eyes, no tidy absolution. She placed her hand on his forearm, a small steadying thing. "You did what you knew how to do with what you had," she said. "Wasn't enough to undo the fever. Being late is a kind of hell. But hell doesn't always mean you were cruel on purpose. He wanted to argue that he had failed in a fundamental way. She did not let him. She said instead, "It is what it is. It is also not the end of what you can be." When the first storm of spring came, sudden and savage, wind gnawing at roofs and rain driving sideways, the town remembered how precarious their lives were. Rivers rose. The creek swelled like a fist. Low fences failed and livestock panicked. A call went up from the miller. His barn, which stood near the low-lying marsh, threatened to be claimed by the water. People gathered. In the teeth of the storm, fears are temporary things, and desperate courage the better currency. Elias and Margaret were already moving. They hooked ropes, tied halters, led line of neighbors to the miller's property. The mule, steady in the teeth of fear, pulled a line like a creature who knew the weight of being abandoned and chose now to anchor others instead. The rain drove and the wind screamed, but their hands made a circle of calm. One person steadying a beam, another hurling a rope. The miller's barn held, groaning and creaking. But it held. They hauled the last of the cattle to higher ground with breath burning in their lungs. When the storm passed, the town smelled of wet hay and smoke, and a collective relief that tasted almost like laughter. In that exhausted, muddy aftermath, gossip lost its teeth. The faces that had once watched with narrowed eyes looked instead at the hands that had worked until numbness set in. They spoke in low voices of the widow who didn't leave and the man who shouldered more than grief. That evening, a wagon pulled in with the pastor at the lead. Hat doffed, face softened in a way that said the sermon would be different the next Sunday. He came to Elias's porch where Margaret stood brushing the mule. "Mercer," the pastor said, voice thick, "on behalf of the town, the church, and, well, folks that were too quick to judge. Thank you." Elias, who had once wanted nothing but to pull the shutters and let the wind have its say, found that his fingers curled and relaxed at the same time. He could not remember when he'd last felt publicly thanked for anything that wasn't a transaction. The word landed in him oddly. It was small, but it held a shape he had forgotten. Margaret looked at him then, eyes bright despite fatigue. "There's work to be done still," she said. "People need care, and the mule needs better hay." They all laughed once, brittle, then softer. It felt like a ceremony more than mere relief, a social stitch mending a small rag of distrust. In the weeks that followed, small changes knotted themselves into habit. The children's lessons grew into regular evenings. Mrs. Harmon brought over a pie once and then twice, each time her expression a study in reluctant thaw. Old Henderson arrived with a sack of seed and a comment about how the garden might be planted. Again, if a certain pair had the patience to tend it. Elias began to shape the plot behind the cabin, turning over dark soil with slow, deliberate strokes, while Margaret knelt by the rows, fingers deep in earth, coaxing seeds into their beds the way she coaxed recalcitrant children into reading. One evening, while planting, a neighbor came by with an armful of manure, and a joke about how a man's worth was proved by the ground he'd make fertile. Elias wiped his brow and laughed, something easy and unforced, and Margaret's head tipped toward him. The mule stood nearby, watching as if approving. That night in the quiet that follows labor, the three of them sat by the barn, the mule, Margaret, and Elias, sharing bread warmed over coals. For a long time they sat without speaking, feeling the particular kind of peace that comes from being useful and needed in equal measure. At some point Margaret reached and took Elias's hand. Her fingers closed around his, with a familiarity that was not yet an old thing but felt like it could become one. "You were brave in the storm," she said simply. "No," he answered at once. "You were." She smiled, a small private thing, and leaned her head for a fraction of a second on his shoulder. No promises, no declarations, only a tender acknowledgement that two broken things could rest together for an hour or a lifetime. They did not press meaning into that moment. They did not have to. The farm, the town, the mule, the garden, they were all slow work, and their lives were learning to be the same. The slowest things are the most honest. Outside the night held its breath, and the creek hummed on. Inside Elias's chest something loosened. It was not whole, It was not healed, but it was moving. Enough for him to understand that the path forward would be made step by step, not in a single holy cure. The next morning the town would wake, chores would call, and gossip would find new bones to pick. But for the moment, by the low barn light with the smell of earth strong as memory, two people sat with a mule between them and the future felt, improbably, like a thing they could touch. Summer arrived the way old friends do, quietly, without ceremony, without asking permission. Warmth seeped back into the land until the soil felt alive beneath a man's boots. Grass turned the color of fresh promise, and the river that had once frozen stiff now sang boldly over stone. Days stretched long, and evenings settled with the ease of a slow exhale. Elias found himself standing straighter, speaking fuller, laughing in ways that felt unfamiliar in his own mouth. The town had grown used to the sight of him and Margaret riding together, her on the mare she'd brought from her sister's wagon, him walking alongside with the mule who now followed as faithfully as a shadow. Each morning Margaret opened the shutters of the small room Elias had built by hand, her veterinary practice now marked with a wooden sign, carved with careful letters. Folks who once whispered controversy now knocked on the door with sick goats and injured chickens and gratitude lingering awkwardly on their tongues. Children came running after lessons with questions about bones and bandages, each one calling her Miss Hale, with reverence that softened every corner of her expression. Elias watched her quietly, often from the porch, while mending a harness or cleaning a bridle. He felt something in him unknot a little more each day. With her near, the silence in the cabin no longer sounded like an accusation. It sounded like a home learning to breathe again. The mule, stronger now than he'd ever been under his old life, grazed lazily near the well, tail swishing like he had nothing in the world left to fear. His ribs had disappeared beneath a coat sleek and coppery in the sun. And Elias knew, though he would not say it aloud, that Margaret had saved him with more than medicine. She had given him a reason to trust. One warm evening, while the sun dimmed down to a deep amber over the ridge, Margaret stood by the half-grown garden Elias and she had planted in the spring. The beans climbed their poles in hopeful spirals. The tomatoes showed their first blush. Roses, Sarah's roses, had pushed tentative blooms along the fence line. Margaret knelt, brushing soil from her hands. "Your wife tended this with care," she said softly. "I can feel it. The ground remembers." Elias stepped beside her. "She'd like that it's alive again. She'd like you." The words escaped him before he could decide if he should offer them. Margaret slowly rose, hands still dusty with earth. "And you?" she asked quietly. "What do you like?" He didn't answer at first. He looked out at the changing land. The golden wind that bent the tall grass, the smoke rising from nearby ranch houses where families cooked supper. Then he looked at her, and in the gentleness of her gaze he saw no pressure, no expectation, just a woman who'd lost as deeply as he had, who understood grief not as a wound but as a room one learns to live inside. "I like that peace doesn't feel like a stranger anymore," he said finally, "and I like that you're here." Margaret's eyes shimmered. Not with tears, something quieter, steadier, like trust. She touched his arm, light as a promise that did not need to be spoken aloud. Their shared quiet was interrupted by the sound of someone calling from the gate. A rider approached, a tall man with sandy hair, leading a tired-looking horse behind him. When he reached them, he dismounted with the shaky relief of someone who'd been riding far too long. "Begging your pardon," he said. "Heard there's a healer here. My son's pony kicked wrong and sliced his leg on a fence. We got the bleeding to stop, but I don't trust my own know-how." Margaret nodded. "Bring him in the morning light. I'll come look at him now." The man brightened with gratitude and gestured her toward his horse. She mounted with practiced ease and gave Elias a brief nod. "I'll be back before dusk." He watched her disappear down the trail, dust rising behind her, and felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear, exactly, but the ache of caring. A man gets used to solitude. It's the returning of warmth that unsettles him. Dusk stretched into dark. Light faded from the hills. Elias tended to chores, splitting wood for winter stores, sweeping the barn, checking the mule's water. But as the sky turned pitch blue, his glance flicked often toward the road. Too often. The hours crept. When hoofbeats finally rose from the distance, he exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Margaret rode toward the cabin, shoulders slumped, face pale beneath the moon's thin glow. He walked out to meet her. "You're late," he said softly. "I know," she whispered, sliding down from the saddle. "The boy's pony had infection. Took longer than I expected. Are you hurt?" "No," she said, but her voice trembled, betraying exhaustion deeper than she wanted to admit. "Just tired." He took the reins from her hands, leading the mare to the barn, and she followed him inside. Under the lantern light, her face looked worn, not aged, but strained by a day's labor that had taken more than it gave. Without speaking further, Elias reached for her coat and brushed dirt from her sleeves. His hands lingered without intention. She stood still beneath his touch. "You don't have to carry everything alone," he murmured. Her breath caught. "Neither do you." The words hung between them, soft, brave. He took her hand, not with hunger, not with haste, but with the gentle certainty of a man who had spent years learning to speak again. Her fingers curled into his as though remembering the shape of belonging. Lightning flickered far away, summer lightning, harmless, just enough to brighten the barn's beams. The mule shifted and settled as if even he approved. Margaret looked up at Elias then, truly looked, and something unspoken, long building, finally settled between them with the weight of inevitability. Still, she asked softly, "Is this all right?" He nodded. Yes. In that slow-burning moment, their foreheads met, breath mingling in the warm, hay-scented air, and the grief of two wounded lives merged into something new. Not erasing, not replacing, but joining, as tender as a sunrise, as patient as the seasons. They did not kiss yet. They didn't need to. Some moments become sacred simply by existing. The following weeks passed with a gentler current. The town accepted Margaret as part of the land, as much as the mule or the creek or the lonely roads she traveled for her work. Elias watched her with a quiet pride she pretended not to notice. Every evening their hands brushed a little longer. Every sunrise their steps fell in easy rhythm. They were building something, slowly, honestly. One evening, as autumn whispered along the horizon and the first cold returned like an old memory, Elias took Margaret to the ridge where the land opened in great sweeping folds. The sunset painted the sky in copper and rose, colors the ground itself seemed to hold. He pointed toward a small clearing nestled beneath a bend of oak trees. "I'm thinking of building another room," he said. If you're staying," Margaret exhaled shakily. "Are you asking me to stay for the work? Or for you?" "For us," he answered. The wind shifted. Leaves rustled like applause. She looked at him, eyes warm, steady, and nodded. "I've been staying since spring. Took you long enough to ask." He laughed, a real laugh, deep in his chest, and she stepped closer, closing the distance between grief and rebirth. This time when she lifted her face, he did kiss her. Slow, gentle, certain, like a man who knew the value of fragile things. The mule grazed nearby, tail swishing contentedly. The land around them breathed easy, as if exhaling a story that had been held too long. When they parted, Margaret whispered, "Your heart found its way home." Elias looked at her, at the oak trees, at the sky blooming with color, and felt, for the first time in years, truly alive. "Not home," he said quietly. "Family." Behind them, the cabin waited with its warm lamp, and the world felt new again, shaped by loss, rebuilt by hope, and held together by the simple, stubborn courage of two people choosing to stay.